Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime Battles. Get comfortable, pull your blanket up just a little bit, let your shoulders drop, feel gravity pull you down. Rest your head. You don't have anything to do right now, you don't have anywhere to be. Tonight, we're going to take you somewhere far away and a long, long time ago. Somewhere warm, somewhere heavy with history. We are going to tell you the story of the Fall of Saigon. Before we talk about generals and presidents and the roar of helicopter blades, let's just arrive. Let's step into the place itself. Saigon, now known as Ho Chi Minh City, located in the far south of Vietnam, resting along the banks of the Saigon River, which winds lazily through the Delta lowlands like it has no particular ambition to get anywhere at all. It is, in every sense, a river at ease with itself. The city sits at roughly 10 degrees north of the equator, just 10 degrees. It's very close to the belly of the earth, and you can feel it. The climate here is what meteorologists call a tropical wet and dry climate. 2 seasons and 2 seasons only, the wet and the less wet. There is no cold here. There is no autumn. There is no frost. There is only heat and the question of how much rain is coming today. April in Saigon is the tail end of the dry season. The air is dense. The temperature in late April of 1975 hovered between 95 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. With humidity so thick it had texture. You didn't just breathe the air in Saigon in April, you wore it. It settled on your skin like a second shirt. It slowed everything down. The city itself was enormous by the standards of the day. Nearly 4 million people packed into a sprawling, chaotic, beautiful urban landscape. French colonial architecture lined broad, tree-canopied boulevards. The ghosts of previous occupation still standing in plaster and wrought iron. Tamarind trees stretched their heavy limbs over the sidewalks. Cyclo drivers pedaled lazily through the haze. Street vendors sold pho and banh mi from carts that seemed to have always been there and always will be. The Mekong Delta spread out to the southwest, a vast emerald green patchwork of rice paddies, mangrove swamps, and tributaries so numerous that to draw them all on a map would be an act of madness. The land here was flat, almost perfectly, unnervingly flat. The horizon went on in every direction, interrupted only by the occasional stand of coconut palms, dark green against a pale, washed-out sky. The South China Sea lay less than 50 miles to the east. On clear days, and late April offered some very clear days before the clouds of the monsoon began their slow return. You could feel the ocean's influence in a slight, merciful coastal breeze that drifted through the city in the late afternoon like a deep breath. Smell Saigon in April of 1975, and you'd smell diesel exhaust from 1,000 motorcycles and military vehicles. You'd smell charcoal cooking fires, fish sauce, the sweetness of tropical fruit at a market stall. You'd smell the river, dark and muddy and alive. And underneath it all, if the wind shifted, you might smell something else, something acrid, something chemical. The unmistakable scent of war that had been burning nearby for 30 years. That war was almost over. To understand those final days, we have to understand just briefly, just gently, how the world had arrived at this moment. The Vietnam War and its American chapter had been grinding on since the early 1960s. hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops had rotated through this sweltering country. More than 58,000 of them never came home. The Vietnamese, North and South, lost millions. The numbers are so large that they became almost abstract, like trying to hold the ocean in your hands. By 1973, the Paris Peace Accords had been signed. American combat troops had withdrawn, but the war between North and South Vietnam had never actually stopped. It had just become quieter for a moment, like a fire that's been left without fuel, still burning, but smaller, waiting. In 1975, it stopped waiting. In January of 1975, North Vietnamese forces under the supreme command of General Van Tien Dung, a disciplined, methodical, and deeply ideological commander, began a major offensive. One by one, the cities of South Vietnam began to fall. Phuc Long in January, Ban My Thuot in March, Da Nang, enormous, vital, Da Nang in late March. Province after province folded with a speed that shocked even the North Vietnamese leadership, who had planned for a 2-year campaign and found themselves ahead of schedule by many months. In Hanoi, in the cool, green-shaded offices of the Politburo, there was quiet disbelief and then quiet exhilaration. The moment they had worked toward for decades was arriving early. In Washington, in the wood-paneled offices of a very different kind of government, there was something closer to quiet dread. Let us visit some of the key figures of these final days. Think of them as characters in a very, very slow, very, very sad play. In Washington, President Gerald Ford, a decent, steady man who had never particularly wanted to be president and had inherited this war like one inherits an old, broken-down house, was receiving reports that grew grimmer by the hour. He had asked Congress for emergency military aid to South Vietnam. Congress, exhausted and disillusioned after years of war, had said no. Ford understood what they had meant. Ford's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, sharp-minded, unsentimental, and carrying a Nobel Peace Prize for the accords he had helped negotiate, was navigating the impossible geometry of American credibility. He didn't want a chaotic collapse. He wanted something that looked, at least from a distance, like a dignified conclusion. In Saigon, at the Grand American Embassy on Thong Nhat Boulevard, a modern, fortress-like compound with a rooftop helicopter pad and a tamarind tree in the courtyard, Ambassador Graham Martin sat at his desk. Martin was a proud, sometimes stubborn man who had lost his adopted son in the Vietnam War. He believed, long after most had stopped believing, that South Vietnam could be saved, or at least he needed to believe it. His delayed acceptance of reality would cost precious planning time in the days ahead. In the presidential palace, a broad, low, modernist building of pale concrete set in a manicured ground, sat General Duong Van Minh, known to everyone as Big Minh. Tall for a Vietnamese man, soft-spoken, a former boxer, a man who had been in and out of South Vietnamese politics for 20 years, like a tide going in and out. He had been sworn in as president just 2 days before the end. A caretaker leader handed the keys to a house already on fire, in the perhaps naive hope that he could negotiate a peaceful transfer of power with the North. And in the tree lines, the paddies, in the ring roads tightening around Saigon like a slowly closing fist. General Van Tien Dung's forces, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, patient and supplied, certain of their coming victory. April 28th, 1975. The air was still hot and very hot. In the late afternoon, something changed the sound of the city. A formation of A-37 Dragonfly aircraft appeared over Saigon. But these planes bore North Vietnamese markings. They had been captured, flown by a defected South Vietnamese pilot named Nguyen Thanh Trung, who had once bombed the presidential palace in a previous act of defiance and now led this improbable air raid. The bombs fell on Tan Son Nhut Air Base, the main airport on the northern edge of the city. The explosions rolled across Saigon like slow thunder. People in the streets stopped, looked up, and understood. At the embassy, Ambassador Martin received the reports and finally, slowly, like a man waking from a dream he had been holding on to very tightly, began to accept that the end was not coming. The end was here. Washington was called. The order was given. Operation Frequent Wind, the emergency evacuation plan, was to begin the following morning. That night, Saigon did not sleep. We must speak, for just a moment, of what war had done to this place before these final hours. Not to disturb your rest, but because the story told only gently is not entirely honest. History sometimes requires us to look at the hard things. In the weeks before the fall, as the NVA tightened their ring around the capital, the fighting on the city's outskirts had been brutal beyond easy description. At Gian Lac, 40 miles to the northeast, the 18th Division of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, outnumbered, undersupplied, and largely forgotten by the world, held off 4 North Vietnamese divisions for nearly 2 weeks. The battle was ferocious. Artillery rounds fell so thickly that soldiers described the ground as never being still, as though the earth itself had become liquid. Men were buried alive in collapsed trenches, clawing upward through soil and smoke. Cluster munitions ignited the tree line for miles. In one particularly savage afternoon of fighting on April 9th, a single South Vietnamese unit, fewer than 300 men, was reduced to fewer than 40 in the span of 4 hours of close-range combat. With hand-to-hand fighting reported in the final minutes as ammunition ran out and men resorted to entrenching tools and bare hands. The North Vietnamese losses in that same engagement numbered in the hundreds. The grass around the perimeter, witnesses say, was simply colored red. And still the ground shook, and still the artillery came, and still the survivors held the line, because they had nowhere to go and nothing left to do but hold on. They held Gian Lac until April 21st, and then quietly they were ordered to withdraw, because there was nothing left to save. They melted back into the countrysides. Some made it, many didn't. The city they had died to protect was already making other arrangements. April 29th, the last full day. Tan Son Nhut Airport was unusable. The airstrikes and ground shelling had seen to that. The only way out now was by helicopter. At 10:51 in the morning, the coded signal was broadcast over Armed Forces Radio Saigon. It was a weather report. The temperature in Saigon is 105 degrees and rising. Then following that weather report, a particular song began to play, Bing Crosby's White Christmas. To the thousands of Americans and Vietnamese who have been told to listen for it, that gentle, familiar carol played in the blazing April heat of Southeast Asia. It meant one thing: get to the evacuation points now. It is one of the stranger images history has given us. The Christmas song, drifting out of transistor radios on a 100-degree morning while helicopters began to circle. The rooftop of the embassy became the most famous helicopter pad in history. The image is iconic, a line of people climbing an exterior staircase, reaching upward toward a Huey. That image, often misidentified, as the embassy roof was actually a nearby apartment building at 22 Gia Long Street. But the embassy itself was no less chaotic. Thousands of people gathered outside the embassy walls. Vietnamese who had worked alongside Americans for years, translators, drivers, intelligence assets, secretaries, soldiers. People who had every reason to believe that when the North arrived, their past associations would not be forgiven. They pressed against the gates. They handed children over the walls. They begged. Ambassador Martin, still refusing to fully let go, had delayed the evacuation of the embassy compound's own staff, believing until almost the last hour that a negotiated solution might still materialize. It did not. He was, near midnight, finally and firmly told by Washington to get on a helicopter. He walked out of his office carrying the folded American flag that had flown over the embassy. He was one of the last Americans to leave Saigon. Through the night, the CH-46 and the CH-53 helicopters of the U.S. Marines flew back and forth from the fleet offshore. From the USS Blue Ridge and the task force in the South China Sea, in a relay that would ultimately evacuate over 7,000 people in just 19 hours of flying. The pilots flew until their eyes burned. The crews loaded people in the dark by the blue glow of instrument panels. On the rooftop, the tamarind trees in the courtyard below swayed gently in the rotor wash of each departing helicopter. As though waving, the last Marine helicopter lifted off from the embassy roof just before 8 in the morning on April 30th. Below in the courtyard, hundreds of Vietnamese who had waited all night were left behind. The gates, finally, had been closed. It was one of the ugliest moments in American diplomatic history, and those who were there say they still carry it on. At 10:24 a.m., a North Vietnamese tank 843, crashed through the iron gates of the presidential palace. A young soldier named Bu Quang Than ran up the steps of the palace and planted the flag of the National Liberation Front from the balcony. He was just 26 years old. Inside the palace, General Dong Van Minh, Big Min, waited in a reception room with several of his cabinet members. He had prepared a brief statement of surrender. When the North Vietnamese officer arrived to accept it, Min reportedly said, "I have been waiting since early this morning to transfer power to you." The officer replied calmly, "There is no question of transferring power. Your power has crumbled. You cannot give up what you do not have." And that, very quietly, was that. The war was over. Outside in the streets of Saigon, the sounds were complicated. There was celebrating, genuine celebrating, from those who had long waited for reunification, who had lost family to the conflict, who had endured decades of fighting and simply wanted it to stop. And there was silence. The silence of those who had feared this day, who did not know what came next, who stood in doorways with their hands folded and waited to see what this new world might look like. The tamarind trees rustled in the warm April air, indifferent to all of this. The Saigon River flowed on, as lazy and unhurried as ever, down toward the delta and the sea. In the weeks that followed, the city was renamed. Saigon became Ho Chi Minh City, thought to this day. Many of its residents still call it Saigon, quietly among themselves. Hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese were sent to re-education camps, some for months, some for years, some never returned. The boat people, refugees who took the South China Sea in a small, dangerously overcrowded vessel, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their stories are as harrowing as any of the war itself. Graham Martin retired from the Foreign Service, spent years defending his decisions during the evacuation. He died in 1990. Henry Kissinger continued to be one of the most debated figures in American foreign policy history for the rest of his very long life. He passed away in 2023 at the age of 100. Gerald Ford lost the 1976 presidential election to Jimmy Carter. He later said that the Fall of Saigon was one of the hardest moments of not just his presidency, but his life. General Van Tien Dung was celebrated as a hero of unification. He wrote a memoir about the final campaign before he died in 2002. General Dong Van Minh was placed under house arrest for several years before eventually immigrating to France and later to the United States. He spent his final years in Pasadena, California, about as far from Saigon as a man can get, tending to his orchids, which he loved deeply. He died in 2001. The city itself, warm, dense, endlessly alive, kept going. It grew, it changed. Its boulevards still carry the shade of tamarind trees. The river still moves. The heat is still there, still substantial, still wearing you like a second shirt when you step outside. History happened here. You can still feel it. People say on certain quiet evenings when the air is still and the light goes golden over the rooftops, just for a moment, the city holds its breath. And that is the Fall of Saigon. A city, a season, a long, exhausted war finding its end on a hot spring morning while Christmas songs played on the radio. You can settle in now. Let those images fade. Let the helicopter lights disappearing over the South China Sea. Let the river slow down. Let the tamarind trees go still. You don't have to hold on to any of it. Just rest. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out again. Thanks for watching Bedtime Battles. I hope you learned something tonight. I hope my voice provided some level of peace for you guys. I ask if you're still awake, like, subscribe, leave a comment, share with anyone who might be able to use a little history as they fall asleep. See you tomorrow.